the book does try to report in detail the sorts of interactions between Washington and Kyiv, and I tried to sort of give a sense for what were the motivations behind American policy. What was the United States trying to achieve? I tried to discuss some of the difficulties, and I think there were mistakes on the American side. There were also difficulties on the Ukrainian side. One of the problems that we found was sometimes the Ukrainian government could be dysfunctional. One of the examples I cited in the book was, at one point in time, we were giving the Ukrainian military maybe $7 to $8 million a year so that it could buy fuel and oil and diesel for the Ukrainian military so that they could train and that it could then take part in exercises with the U.S. military. What happened, we found, was that that $7 or $8 million each year, it was being taxed by the state tax administration. This was going to drive the American Congress nuts. When the Congress said $8 million is going to Ukrainians' military, and they found that the Ukrainian military was only going to get $6.5 million because the rest was going to be taxes. And I had to explain in lots of different places, look, it's not a matter of the size of the slice of the pie that the state tax administration is getting. The question is, you're not going to get a pie. And we were actually worried that Congress then might move to cut off more assistance. And the frustrating thing was, I raised it at the Ministry of Defense, I raised it at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at the National Security and Defense Council. We couldn't find anybody who could fix this problem and step back and say, okay, the state tax administration has to give up that money because this is $8 million that's coming to the Ministry of Defense that they're not going to get anywhere else. And it was only when we threatened to cut that money off and then invoke some other sanctions that we'd get the Ukrainian government to respond properly. That was a bit frustrating. And there were just other times, too, where I guess a problem that we sometimes had was we seemed to talk past each other. I remember early on in 1998, in some of my first meetings, one of the points I tried to make with my Ukrainian interlocutors was, please don't tell me or the U.S. government yes on a question when you can't deliver or you may not want to deliver. Because the problem is when we hear a yes and then 6 months later there's been no follow-through, it's a much bigger problem for U.S.-Ukraine relations than if you just told us no in the first place. And an example that I write about in the book was in the summer of 2001, in July of 2001, Condelezza Rice, then the National Security Advisor, went to Kyiv. And this was the first high-level official of the George W. Bush administration to go to Ukraine. And she met with President Kuchma. And at the time, the issue was that Ukraine was providing heavy weapons to the Macedonian military. This was at a point where the Macedonia was on the brink of civil war. And NATO was getting ready to put in a stabilization force on the ground in Macedonia. NATO didn't want to see more weapons coming in because NATO forces didn't want to get caught in the middle of some kind of a major battle. So the National Security Advisor, Dr. Rice, asked President Kuchma, please stop this. President Kuchma said he will. The Ukrainians didn't stop sending the weapons until 8 or 9 months later. And I'm not sure they understood just how much damage that did to President Kuchma's reputation in Washington at the start of the Bush administration. When we said the President Kuchma told Dr. Rice the transfers are going to end, and then we continue to see the weapons flow into Macedonia. And that was a problem. And again, where we had a yes, we thought it was an issue that was resolved, and then it wasn't, and then it became a bigger problem. I guess another issue where I think things, had it been played differently, they could have minimized this problem, but it was probably the issue in 2002 that really brought U.S.-Ukraine relations to a low point. And it was the question of the Kольчуга air defense system. In, I'd guess, the first part of 2002, of course, this was the case where there were a number of recordings that had been made in President Kuchma's office in 2000 and 2001, which were then released. We were told that there was a recording that had President Kuchma agreeing to the transfer of the Kольчуга air defense system, or the sale of the Kольчуga air defense system, by a Ukrainian defense plant to Iraq. The problem with the Kольчуga is it's not a normal radar system. It doesn't emit a radar beam. but it tracks airplanes by their radio and radar emissions. And so it creates a situation where the Kольчуга does the tracking. You catch an American or a British plane, and both at that time, American and British planes were regularly flying over Iraq under conditions agreed by the UN Security Council. That plane won't know it's being tracked. And so you could fire a missile at that plane, and then at the last second turn on an active radar to guide the missile to the plane. And the pilot would only have, seconds to react. This was something that we took very seriously. We received the recording. We turned it over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They worked on it and came back to us and said, look, we've looked at this with the help of several other agencies. We all agree, one, that there's nothing on this recording to suggest that it's been spliced together or that it's a fake. We believe it's genuine. And they said, and everyone agrees that that voice is that of President Kuchma. So we raised this. This was of concern. The Ukrainians said, well, let's have an American-British team, the two countries flying over Iraq, come to Kyiv, and we will convince you that this didn't happen. And I remember having a lunch with the Ukrainian ambassador here, that was Ambassador Hyshchenko, and Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Chali, who was visiting from Kyiv, and I said, it's really hard to prove the negative. And for me, the big question to that team is going to be, when you come back, do you feel that everybody was completely transparent with you? That because I'm not sure they can prove the negative, but what I want to do is hear when you come back that you had every possible assistance. And when the team came back, their assessment was, look, when we talked to the Foreign Ministry and the Ministry of Defense, we got everything we asked for. They couldn't have been more open. But they said, when we talked to the National Security and Defense Council, when we talked to the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, we didn't get that cooperation. And so, for example, the team was told that the Security Service of Ukraine had done a big investigation that this concluded didn't happen. And they said, they'd even written a report on it. And when they said, well, can we have a copy of the report? Well, the report came with several sections redacted. And so the question is, well, what's in those sections? During the visit by our team, though it was confirmed that at the day and the time the recording allegedly was made, the person that President Kuchma was talking to was in his office. So there was a certain amount of concern, and this had a political effect. That basically, the United States and NATO then said, look, under these circumstances, we're not prepared at the upcoming NATO summit, which is going to be held in Prague in November of 2002. We're not prepared to have a NATO-Ukraine summit. We're going to reduce that down to ministerial because we're very concerned about what President Kuchma might have done.